My name is Celeste Adeyemi. I'm 31 years old. And the afternoon my mother sat down at my kitchen table and told me that my apartment should belong to my sister was the afternoon I finally understood that being reasonable had never been about reason at all. She said it the way she said most things she had already decided, plainly, without preamble, as though she were reading from a document she had prepared in advance and was now simply presenting for my signature. "You live alone," she said. "Your sister has 3 children. The right thing is obvious." My father, who had come in behind her and was standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, said, "Don't be difficult about this." I looked at both of them. I said no. It was the first time I had said no to either of them about anything that mattered, and the words sat in the room between us like something that had fallen off a shelf, sudden, irreversible, impossible to pretend hadn't happened. What none of them knew, in that moment, was that the apartment was not the only property with my name on it. I should tell you about the apartment first, because the apartment matters, not as a symbol, though it became one, but as a specific physical fact that I had worked toward for 4 years before I got it. It is on the 3rd floor of a building on Verity Street, in a part of the city that was, when I moved in, still in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. The building has 6 units. Mine faces east, which means the mornings are bright and the evenings are quiet. It has 2 bedrooms, which my mother would later cite as evidence that I didn't need the space. 2 bedrooms for 1 person, she said, as if rooms were a rationing problem rather than a choice. The 2nd bedroom was my home office. I worked from it every weekday and some Saturdays and the occasional Sunday when a deadline required it, and the room had in it a desk and a good chair and a filing cabinet and a window that looked onto a courtyard where someone 2 floors down kept a small container garden that I found, without being able to explain why, consistently reassuring. I am a licensed property surveyor. I have been one since I was 26, when I sat the final part of my professional qualification exam after 3 years of supervised practice and passed it on the first attempt. The firm I work for is called Grantham Okafor and Associates, and I joined it as a junior surveyor when I was 24 and have been there since, moving from junior to associate to senior associate over 7 years in a trajectory that my colleagues would call steady, and that I would call the result of showing up and doing the work without requiring anyone to notice. My manager, a man named Patrick Sefton, who has been at the firm for 22 years and who I consider the most competent person I have ever worked alongside, once told me in an annual review that my reports were the ones he trusted most because they never contained a conclusion that wasn't supported by the evidence underneath it. I wrote that down when I got home, not because I needed the validation, I had the evidence, but because it was the most precise description of how I try to operate that anyone had ever offered me, and I wanted to keep it. I tell you this because the way I work is the same way I have always lived, and because the story my family told about me, the one they had been telling for 31 years by the time my mother sat at my kitchen table, was almost the exact opposite. In the family's version, I was the quiet one, the manageable one, the one who did not need much because she did not ask for much. My sister Renata was the one with the life, the husband, the 3 children, the full house, the noise and mess and density of a person who took up visible space. I was the negative space around her. I was what was left when you accounted for Renata. Renata is 4 years older than me. She married her husband, a man named Deo, when she was 26, and they had their first child 18 months later, and their second 2 years after that, and their third in a year that I remember because it was also the year I passed my qualification exam, and at the family dinner where both things were mentioned, the baby's arrival was discussed for 40 minutes and my exam results were mentioned once, in passing, by my father, who said, "Celeste passed her survey thing," and then asked Renata if she had decided on a name. I do not tell this to perform grievance. I tell it because the shape of a family's attention is a form of information, and I had been reading that information for 31 years, and it had told me, consistently and without ambiguity, that my presence in the family was valued in proportion to how little I complicated things. I had learned to be a person who did not complicate things. I had learned it so well that I had applied it to myself, had taken the lesson meant to manage me and turned it inward, so that for a long time I managed myself on behalf of everyone else, preempting inconvenience, smoothing edges, absorbing without comment whatever was directed at me. The apartment on Verity Street was the first thing I had done entirely for myself, without consultation and without accommodation. I found it on a Tuesday evening in March, Came back 3 times before making an offer. Had it surveyed by a colleague I trusted, a woman named Iris Tambley, who had 10 years more experience than me and whose reports I had learned from early in my career, and completed the purchase 11 weeks later. I told my family the week I moved in. My mother's response was to ask whether it was sensible, given that property in that area was unpredictable. My father said it was a lot for one person. Renata said the second bedroom was wasted. I thanked them for their thoughts and went back to unpacking. The conversation at my kitchen table happened 14 months after I moved in. Renata and Deo had been living in a rented house in a suburb 40 minutes from the city center for 6 years, and the house had, in that time, developed a series of structural problems: subsidence in one corner of the ground floor, damp in 2 of the upstairs rooms, a boiler that had been replaced once and was failing again, that the landlord had been slow to address, and that Renata had recently decided she was no longer willing to tolerate. She was not wrong to reach that decision. The house was poorly maintained, and the landlord had a documented history of delayed repairs. What she had decided as a next step was that the obvious solution was my apartment. My mother presented it as a practical matter. The apartment had 2 bedrooms. Renata had 3 children. The arithmetic, she said, was self-evident, though I noted that the arithmetic she was performing did not include me as one of the variables, or rather had resolved me to 0, and was working from there. The proposal, such as it was that I would move out of my apartment and allow Renata and her family to move in. Where I would go was not specified. My mother gestured vaguely toward the idea that I could find somewhere else, somewhere smaller, somewhere more proportionate to my circumstances. My father's contribution was to stand by the window and say, "Don't be difficult." I said no. My mother's expression did something I had not seen it do before. Not surprise, exactly, more the particular recalibration of a person who has run a calculation in their head and gotten a result they had not accounted for. She said, "Celeste. Just my name." As if the name alone, delivered in that register, had always been sufficient to close off whatever it was being deployed against. "No," I said again. "This is my apartment. I bought it. I'm not giving it up." "We're not asking you to give it up," my mother said. "We're asking you to be practical." "You're asking me to vacate my home," I said, "so that Renata can move into it. That is what you're asking." My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the window. Neither of them said anything that contradicted me, because there was nothing to say that would. I asked them to leave. They left. I stood in the kitchen for a while after the door closed, with my hand on the counter, and thought about the word practical, about how many times in my life I had been told to be practical in contexts where the practical solution happened to require me to give something up. Then I made tea and sat at the desk in the second bedroom and opened my laptop and did 2 hours of work. The calls came over the following week. My mother called 3 times. My Aunt Blessing called twice, which told me that my mother had made the situation a broader family matter, which was what she did when a bilateral conversation wasn't producing the result she wanted. Renata did not call. I noted that. The calls followed a pattern. They began with a version of the practical argument, the children, the space, the obvious arithmetic, and when I declined to engage with that, they shifted to a version of the character argument, that my refusal was evidence of something wrong in me, a hardness or selfishness that had always been there and was now finally expressing itself. My Aunt Blessing said, on the second call, that she had always thought I was cold, which she delivered not as an insult but as a sad confirmation of something long suspected. I thanked her for calling and said goodbye. I did not argue with any of them. I did not explain myself beyond what I had already said. I had said no, and no was a complete sentence, and I had nothing to add to it that would change anything they intended to think about me. What I did instead, in the 2 weeks after the kitchen table conversation, was something I had been considering for longer than anyone in my family would have guessed. I called a woman named Vivian Asare, who was a commercial property solicitor I had worked with twice through Grantham Okafor and Associates, and whose judgment I considered reliable. I asked if she had time for a consultation. She did. I went to her office on a Thursday morning, sat across from her at a desk covered in an organized system of folders that I recognized as the system of someone who had too much to track and had developed a rigorous method for it, and I told her what I had been thinking. I had, over the preceding 4 years, been purchasing property. Not dramatically. Not with windfalls or inheritance or any single large infusion of capital. I had done it the way I did everything else. Consistently, methodically, one decision at a time, with the patience of someone who understood that a thing takes the time it takes and that trying to compress the timeline usually introduces errors. I had bought my apartment on Verity Street. I had, the following year, purchased a one-bedroom flat in a building 2 streets away that I had identified as undervalued based on a surveyor's assessment I had written myself in a professional capacity and had then, in my own time, cross-referenced against the planning records for the surrounding area and the 5-year price trajectory of comparable properties nearby. I had rented it out through a letting agency to a tenant who had been in situ for 14 months and had never missed a payment. The monthly rental income was $1,650. I had also, 6 months before the kitchen table conversation, entered into a joint purchase agreement with a colleague, a senior surveyor named Marcus Ifa, who had his own independent read on the local market and who I had known for 4 years and trusted in the specific, bounded way you trust someone whose professional judgment you have tested and found consistent. On a 2-bedroom property in a building 3 blocks from Verity Street that needed cosmetic work and 1 structural repair and that we had bought at $287,000, below the surveyor's estimate of post-repair value. I had not told my family about any of this. Not because I was hiding it. The records were public, anyone who looked could find them, but because it had not been relevant to any conversation we had ever had, and because I had learned, over 31 years, that information shared with my family became information available to everyone in my family's orbit, reshaped by the telling and returned to me in forms I had not authorized. I told Vivian. I laid it out the way I would lay out a client file, chronologically, with the documentation, without editorializing. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone organizing a response. "You own 3 properties," she said. 2 outright, 1 in joint purchase, I said. She nodded slowly. "And your family believes you own 1. "My family believes I own an apartment that's too large for me," I said. Vivian looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who is deciding how much professional neutrality the situation requires. Then she said, "What would you like to do?" I told her. We spent the rest of the morning working through it. The family meeting was called by my mother 6 weeks after the kitchen table conversation. She called it, in the message she sent to the family group, a chance to talk things through properly, which was the language she used when she had assembled enough people to make an outcome feel inevitable. It was held at my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon, the house I had grown up in on a street called Farrow Lane, in a room my mother called the sitting room and my father called the front room, and which was, by any name, the room where the family conducted its formal business. There were 8 people when I arrived. My parents, Renata and Deo, my Aunt Blessing and her husband, and 2 cousins, Temmie and Shade, who I suspected had been invited less for their opinions than for the weight of their presence, the visible evidence that the family had reached a consensus and was presenting it collectively. Renata's children were not there. They were at Deo's mother's house, which I noted as a choice. Children as a rhetorical resource, deployed or withheld depending on the argument being made. I sat down. I accepted the cup of tea my mother poured. I waited. My mother opened by saying that what the family wanted was not unreasonable, that families supported each other in times of need, that Renata's situation was a genuine difficulty, and that I was in a position to help. She was calm and measured. She had thought about the framing. She said, "We are not asking you to sacrifice anything. We are asking you to be part of this family." Renata, sitting across from me, looked at her hands. Deo looked at the wall. I had the impression that neither of them had been the primary architects of the meeting, that the momentum had come from somewhere further back, from a conversation between my parents and my aunt that had started from the premise of my refusal and worked backward to an explanation for it. I let my mother finish. Then I said, "I'd like to share something." I opened the folder I had brought. It was a standard document folder, the kind I used for client files, dark blue, unremarkable. I took out 3 sets of papers, each clipped together, and set them on the coffee table in front of me. "This," I said, indicating the first set, "is the title deed for the apartment on Verity Street." I set it to one side. "This is the title deed for the 1-bedroom flat on Crane Street." I set it beside the first. And this is the joint purchase agreement for the property on Aldgate Road, which was completed in March. The room was quiet. My Aunt Blessing's husband leaned forward slightly, as if recalibrating the distance to the table. Renata looked up from her hands. Her expression was the kind that does not announce itself. I own 2 properties outright, I said, and a 50% share in a third. The Crane Street flat is tenanted. The Aldgate Road property is in the process of being prepared for the market. I have a solicitor, Vivian Asare, who manages the legal side, and a letting agent, Carla Reed at Fernside Lettings, who manages the tenanted property. This is what I do with my time outside of work. My father's hand, which had been resting on the arm of his chair, went very still. I tell you this, I continued, not to make a point about what I have, but because the conversation we've been having for 6 weeks has been based on a premise that I have one apartment that is too large for me and that the practical solution is to give it to Renata. I want the conversation to have accurate information in it. My mother said, Celeste, I didn't. I know, I said. None of you knew. Because I don't discuss my finances with the family, for the same reason I don't discuss anything I'm building before it's built. But since you've made my apartment part of a family conversation, I thought it was fair to give you the full picture. I picked up my tea. I drank it. I waited. Temmie, one of the cousins, made a sound that was not quite a word. Shade was looking at the folder on the table. Deo cleared his throat. He said, So the flat, the one on Crane Street, is tenanted, I said. There's a lease in place through Fernside. It runs another 8 months. A pause. When it ends, Deo said and then stopped, as if he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence without asking the question he was now aware he could not simply assume the answer to. When it ends, I said, I'll make a decision about what to do with it. That decision will be mine. My mother sat very straight in her chair. My Aunt Blessing put down her teacup. The specific sound of it, ceramic on a glass-topped table, was the loudest thing in the room. I'm not going to give up the apartment on Verity Street, I said. I live there. I work there. It's mine. What I am willing to do, as I've been willing to do since this conversation started, is help Renata find a suitable alternative, through my professional contacts, through the letting network I work within, through any knowledge I have that might be useful. That offer has been on the table since the beginning. It remains on the table. Renata looked at me. It was the first time she had looked directly at me since I arrived. Her expression was the kind that contains more than one thing, and is working out which one to let show. I looked back. I didn't add anything. I think, my mother said, after a pause that had gone on long enough to become a different kind of answer, we should all take some time. That sounds sensible, I said. I finished my tea. I put the documents back in the folder. I said goodbye to everyone in the room by name, including Temmie and Shade, who had come to add weight to a consensus and were now sitting with the particular stillness of people who have found themselves at the wrong meeting. I put on my coat. I drove home. The first thing that shifted was Renata. She called me 4 days after the family meeting, on a Wednesday evening, and she called from her own phone rather than in a 3-way arrangement with my mother, which told me something before she said a word. She said, I didn't know about the other properties. I said I knew. She said, I wouldn't have if I'd known. I wouldn't have let it get to the meeting. I said, I believe you. There was a pause. She said, Deo thinks we should have come to you directly. In the beginning. I said, that would have been better, yes. We talked for 20 minutes. She told me about the house, the damp that had spread into the second upstairs bedroom, the boiler engineer's report, the landlord's solicitor's letter that had used the word reasonable in a context that she felt was not. I asked her a few questions. Not family questions, professional ones, the kind I would ask a client. What was the scope of the surveyor's report? Had the landlord been given formal written notice of each defect with a specified time frame for repair? Was the tenancy agreement on a standard assured short-hold basis? She had the answers to 2 of the 3. I told her what to ask for on the 3rd. I gave her the name of a housing solicitor, a woman named Fran Obi, who had a good record on landlord repair disputes and whose firm was accessible on a fixed-fee basis for initial consultations. Renata said, Why are you helping me? I said, because your landlord has a documented pattern of delayed repairs and you have 3 children in a house with damp in 2 rooms, and that is a housing problem, and I know about housing. A pause. Celeste, she said. It's fine, I said. Call friend Obi. She did. The dispute with the landlord was resolved, with friend Obi's involvement. Over the following 2 months, the landlord carried out the boiler replacement and the damp remediation under a written schedule of works and an agreed penalty clause for delays, which Fran had drafted and which the landlord had signed after 1 round of correspondence. Renata sent me a message when the boiler was installed. It said, "Functioning heating, functioning heating, functioning heating." Then a second message, "Thank you." I replied with a thumbs up. I was in the middle of a site visit and had mud on my boots and a report to write by 4 o'clock, and the message arrived at the exact right moment, which is to say the moment when I needed something to be straightforward. The Crane Street Flats tenancy ended 8 months after the family meeting, as I had said it would. My tenant, a woman named Priya, who worked in medical administration and had been an entirely unremarkable tenant in the best possible sense, had found a place closer to her hospital and had given notice in the standard way, 2 months ahead, in writing through Fernside. I did not immediately relet it. I spent 3 weeks considering what to do with it, the way I spent 3 weeks considering any decision that had a long tail. I looked at the numbers, the rental income against the management fee, the current market rate for comparable properties in the area, the capital gain I could expect if I chose to sell against the income stream I would forego. I ran the projections in a spreadsheet the way I ran client projections, with 3 scenarios and a sensitivity analysis on the key variables. Then I called Renata. I told her that the Crane Street flat was available and that I was willing to let it to her and Deo and the children on a standard assured short-hold tenancy at the current market rate for the area, which was $1,720 per month, and that the tenancy would be managed through Fernside in the same way the previous one had been, with all repairs reported through the agency's standard process, and that I would be the landlord of record, which meant that all communications about the property would go through the agency and not through Sunday dinners. She was quiet for a moment. The market rate, she said. Yes, I said. Not a family rate. No, I said. A market rate, documented in a standard lease, managed professionally. That's what I'm offering. Another pause. Why not a family rate? Because, I said, a family rate would mean a different kind of arrangement, one where the terms aren't clear and the expectations aren't documented and the relationship between landlord and tenant and the relationship between sisters gets tangled up in a way that's bad for both. This way the tenancy is the tenancy and we're sisters on top of it, not instead of it. I heard Renata breathe out slowly. Deo will want to see the lease, she said. Vivian will send it, I said. Take whatever time you need. They signed the lease 3 weeks later. I was at my desk in the 2nd bedroom on Verity Street when Vivian's office sent confirmation. I noted it in the file I kept for the Crane Street property under the heading tenant, R&O, Bankole, commencing date, and I closed the file and made a cup of tea and sat at the window that looks onto the courtyard and watched the container garden for a few minutes, the way I did when I needed the day to settle. My mother took longer. She did not call me for 6 weeks after the family meeting. When she did call, she did not open with the apartment. She opened with a question about whether I was coming to my cousin Shade's birthday gathering the following weekend, which was the family's way of testing whether a silence had become a rupture or was still a pause. I said I was coming. I went. I brought a gift for Shade, and ate the food and talked to Temmie about his work. He was in logistics and there was a routing problem he was trying to solve that I found genuinely interesting, and I said hello to my mother when I arrived and goodbye when I left, and everything in between was ordinary. Ordinary was what I had been working toward. Not reconciliation as a project, not a conversation where things were resolved and declared resolved. Just the resumption of ordinary, which was the only version of family I had ever found sustainable. My mother called again 2 weeks later. She said, I didn't know what you'd built. I said, I know. She said, you didn't tell us. I said, no. A pause. She said, I should have asked. I said, yes. Another pause. Your father thinks the same, she said. I said I appreciated that. She said she had told Renata that the arrangement, The lease, the agency, the market rate was sensible, and that Renata had agreed. I said I was glad. Then she said, "Your sister is a good tenant, I imagine." And I said, "She hasn't been in long enough to be a bad one." My mother made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. My father and I had our conversation the following Sunday over the phone. While he was in the garden, I could hear the particular ambient quiet of the Farrow Lane garden in the background, the same garden I had sat in as a child doing homework on summer evenings. He said, "I looked up the Aldgate Road property." I said, "You can find it on the planning portal, yes." He said, "When did you start?" I told him, the Verity Street apartment first, then Crane Street a year later, then the joint purchase with Marcus Aoife. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I said don't be difficult." I said, "I know." He said, "That was the wrong thing to say." I said, "Yes, it was." He said, "I'm sorry for it." I said I appreciated that. We talked for another 10 minutes about the Aldgate Road property. He had questions about the structural repair, which was a ground floor wall tie replacement, and I answered them because he had worked in construction management early in his career, and the questions were good ones, and it was the most direct conversation we had had in years. The Aldgate Road property sold 14 months after Marcus Aoife, and I completed it. The sale price was $341,000 against a purchase price of $287,000 and repair costs of $31,200, which produced a gross profit of $22,800 per share before fees and tax. Marcus and I split it as agreed. I put my share into a savings account I keep for acquisition deposits and noted it in my property spreadsheet. I did not tell my family the number. I told Vivian because she was handling the transaction. I told Patrick Sefton at the office because the sale completed on a day I needed to leave early, and I mentioned why. He said, "Good result." I said, "The wall tie job came in under budget, which helped." He said, "Always does when you find the right contractor." I said yes. That was the extent of the celebration, and it was sufficient. I am 31 years old. I own 2 properties outright and am in the process of identifying a third. My tenant on Crane Street is my sister Renata, who pays her rent on time through Fernside Lettings and who called me last month to ask whether she could plant something in the small back courtyard, and to whom I said yes, because it is a courtyard and not a structural element, and the lease permits minor external modifications with landlord consent, and I consented. The container garden, when I imagine it, looks something like the one I watch from my window on Verity Street. I have not seen it yet. I will probably at some point. My mother and I have Sunday calls most weeks. My father has started sending me articles about planning regulation changes with no commentary, just a link, which I have come to understand as his version of thinking of you. There is something I have come to understand about the years between being 22 and being 31, about the long practice of being the one who didn't complicate things. The version of yourself that says yes to everything is not a generous person. She is a person who has not yet learned that generosity requires a self to give from, that you cannot share what you have dissolved. What I built on Verity Street and on Crane Street and on Aldgate Road, I built because I stopped performing smallness on behalf of people who had never asked me to grow. The most useful thing you can do, when someone has decided who you are, is simply become someone else entirely, quietly, without announcement, in the time it takes to sign a lease and another lease and another. If you watch this far, I have a question specifically for you. At the family meeting, when Celeste opened the dark blue folder and placed 3 sets of documents on the coffee table, there were 8 people in the room. In that moment, before anyone spoke, which person's expression do you think changed first? And do you think it was the person Celeste expected? Leave your answer below. I read every single one. And if this story is the kind that stays with you, subscribe. A new story comes every week, and the next one might be exactly what you needed.